Breaking news. I was totally wrong about the previous Canon R1 specs that I showed, but I think we have correct specs this time. So I'm going to share those with you and talk about how it compares to the Canon R3, the Nikon Z8, and the Sony A9 Mark III. Lumix, which is Panasonic, used some Nikon photos in their advertising for the Panasonic S5. I'm going to give you my take on it and show you exactly what they did. And I'm also going to talk about a new service that will make custom AI-based shows for you, where you literally type a description like a new episode of Seinfeld that happens in an Italian restaurant, and it makes the rest up for you. First, I want to thank our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is where you start when you want to create an incredible website. Start at squarespace.com/Tony. There you can see just how easy it is to set up your own website. I promise it's even easier than setting up social media. You can get your own custom domain, email addresses, take appointments from clients, sell products. Every business should definitely have their own website, but I create websites around my own personal projects. If you decide to sign up, which you probably will because it's awesome, the coupon code Tony gets you 10% off. Thanks for sponsoring us all these years, Squarespace. First, I want to talk about Fable Showrunner, which is a startup tech company that is promising to make custom TV shows based on descriptions. Right now, you could go to Midjourney or a few other AI text-to-image generators and type in a description of a picture, and it will show you a picture, and it works pretty well. The next generation of this is going to be video. Many companies are already working on generating short video clips, and they work okay. Things like Sora actually work. This is the next stage after that, where you provide a text description, something like ChatGPT writes a script for it, and then that script is turned scene by scene into a video, a TV show, a movie that you can watch. This is not a reality today, though they did do an episode of South Park, which is shockingly okay.
Mr. Andreessen, have you ever dreamed of watching The Matrix, but with Danny DeVito as Neo?
Can't say that I have.
Well, with our new deepfake streaming service, Queepy, that dream could become a reality.
And as their lead engineer, I can assure you that the technology we're using is top-notch.
But I wanted to mention it because we've repeatedly said that this is the sort of dystopian future that's largely going to upend things like you watching our YouTube video. There will be a time, maybe it's 5 years from now, maybe it's 10 years from now, when AI is just generating the most perfect content for us individually, perhaps even featuring the faces and bodies of ourselves and our family in the TV shows. And that AI content will be so compelling that it's going to steal a large part of the market share from traditional outlets that you might be watching now, like me. Now, I don't think Fable Showrunner is going to blow up. It's probably, odds are, it's just like a tech company looking to scrape up some of the funding that people are just throwing at every AI project now. I bet the founders will probably sell it off in a year or two and make a decent amount of money and nothing will ever come of it. But I am confident that Max, Netflix, Hulu, Google are all working on their own services like this, and that at some point this will be a more realistic future. Our next story, PhotoRumors.com, found that Lumix, which is Panasonic, was using pictures taken with other cameras in their Japanese marketing material. Now the S5, I think, looks cool. It's like a vlogger-friendly camera with no mechanical shutter, no hot shoe for a flash, and no electronic viewfinder. That means it's useful for some tasks like vlogging yourself, recording yourself in video, but it's not useful for things like wildlife photography because you can't use a super long lens with a rear screen very well. You really need an electronic viewfinder for that. You need a fast readout speed. They used pictures demonstrating how things like animal detect autofocus worked that were taken with a Nikon camera. Some others were taken with a Canon camera. Some were taken with other Lumix cameras. The original version of this page that Photo Rumors screenshotted didn't show this as clearly being disclosed, but as soon as Panasonic was alerted to the error, they apologized for it, and now everything has a clear disclosure. Like, how hard is it for y'all to go take some pictures with your new camera to demonstrate its capabilities? I understand tech writing is hard. I was a tech writer for many years, and it's tempting just to use stock images, but you do work for a camera company, and I can't imagine how anybody thought it was okay to use pictures taken with a Nikon to demonstrate the features of a Panasonic. But also, story time. Once I was reading a manual for one of the Panasonic cameras, I want to say a GH4, I found a picture of myself, and that totally weirded me out because that was a picture that Chelsea took with her Canon, I think a 5D Mark II, and then we sold it for stock. So whoever was writing the manual just wanted a sports picture of a guy playing golf, but it happened to be me in my modeling years, taken by Chelsea in her stock photography years. But in the comments, what do you think? How serious of a crime is this? Like, Panasonic apologized. It wasn't a good thing, but I also don't think it's a felony. I think it's a misdemeanor. They weren't saying the Panasonic S5 can do this. They were just like, this is what Animal Detect looks like. Next up, from Canon Rumors, the story we're all waiting for, the real specs for the Canon R1. Now, I'm not sure these are real because the last ones turned out to be incorrect. But Canon Rumors seems to have some confidence, and I have confidence in Canon Rumors. First, a couple of leaked pictures via Camera Work. And you can see the new R1 in use here with some black tape over the branding. You can see nice square edges, a little bit of a different look to it. I'm really weirded out by the fact that they're using a Canon FD 50 f1.4 manual focus lens on this sports camera. Like, what a weird lens choice. And we finally see the back of the camera, which reveals it looks pretty much like every other 1 series camera like the Canon R3, but it does have a flip screen. That was one of the open questions. How infuriated are sports photographers going to be that it has a flip screen? I personally, I'm a fan of flip screens, even for sports photography stuff, because you can flip the screen around and protect it, and it gives you the versatility to film in a wide variety of different environments, and I just don't think the flip screen is as big of a handicap as other people seem to think it is. So I applaud this, and I will predict right now that since Canon has provided a flip screen on their flagship, Sony and Nikon will put flip screens on their next flagship too, because they're just also like afraid to take a big chance. On to the specs again via Canon Rumors. I thought it was going to have a 30 megapixel sensor. I was kind of pumped about a little more resolution in a sports body, but it looks like it's going to be a 24 megapixel sensor. Basically the same resolution as the Sony A9 Mark III and the Canon R3. It is going to be a stack sensor with a very, very fast readout. The leaked specs say it's going to be a 2 millisecond readout, which is each millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. So it's basically 1/500th of a second. And that puts it about twice as fast as the Z8 and Z9. It puts it almost 3 times faster than the Canon R3. And I think this is plenty fast because I shot a lot of action with my Z8 and Z9, and the readout speed has never been a problem. That means it's faster than the Sony A1. And again, shooting sports and wildlife with the Sony A1, the readout speed has never been a problem. But the main competitor here is the Sony A9 Mark III with its global shutter and its 0 millisecond readout speed. So while Canon can't match that readout speed, they'll also likely have much better dynamic range and a lower base ISO. And I think Canon looked at the compromises associated with a global shutter and just said, very fast is fast enough. And I'm inclined to agree. Even in the course of reviewing the A9 Mark III, I really couldn't find any real-world situations where that 0 millisecond readout speed made a significant difference in the final image, including things like flash sync speed. I made a whole video testing this stuff out, and so I applaud Canon for taking this approach instead of just chasing readout speed into infinity. Another headline feature is going to be quad pixel autofocus. Canon's current autofocus system is called dual pixel autofocus, where 2 side-by-side pixels look at the scene and look for contrast. They look for lines to focus on. There's a downside to that, where horizontal lines can't necessarily be distinguished. So a horizontal line on somebody's jersey might lead the camera to miss focus for a split second. Quad pixel autofocus allows for horizontal, vertical, or diagonal contrast, which is pretty much what their existing 1DX does, because the existing DSLR sports cameras have had this type of focus sensor for years, and it was really important for avoiding problems with things like horizontal lines specifically. So while I don't hear anybody complaining about the autofocus performance of cameras like the Z8, the A1, or the Canon R3, this should be better. There should be times when those cameras would fail and this one will not. It's going to be real hard to notice this in the real world, but it gives you some confidence knowing you're going to run into the fewest problems possible. They're also going to have smarter subject tracking, which means that in a very common scenario, you'll be tracking a player here and another player runs in front of them briefly. You want to keep tracking this same player. Some cameras will switch players as one passes in front of the other. Notably, the A9 Mark III from Sony does a really good job of tracking players as one passes in front of the other. The Canon R1 should do a good job of this too. Real world, I have shot a lot of sports in my life, and the way I've always handled this is to just let go of the AF on button and then press the AF on button again when the player I want to track is visible. This will stop you from going like this. This will stop you from like moving your thumb on the AF on button briefly. It'll mean more accurate autofocus. It'll help people get 1% more great shots, and that is where we're at. We're really putting a slightly sharper edge on an already very sharp knife. It looks like the mechanical shutter is going to offer a 16-bit RAW file, so that should allow you for slightly better recovery of shadows. So 16-bit is a lot. And if you use the electronic shutter to get higher shutter speeds or to shoot silently, like if you were shooting golf, you would only get 14 bits out of that. Now, that's really good because I think the Sony A9 Mark III drops to 12-bit RAWs when it's shooting 30 frames per second. So those of you who are nitpicking dynamic range, you're going to appreciate the extra capabilities of the Canon R1. We don't have the full frames per second yet, but they did give us a video spec, which is 6K RAW at 120 frames per second. Now, it's a 24 megapixel sensor, which is usually 6,000 pixels horizontal, 4,000 pixels vertically. So in 16:9:9 aspect ratio, that would be about 6,000 pixels by 3,000 pixels. Now, it's saying 6K RAW, and that sounds like a feature, but it's probably actually a limitation. I would bet it's like the Canon R5 with 8K, where it will record 8K RAW, but it can't do it compressed because the processors that would be compressing the RAW output can't keep up with the data that's flowing. So that's probably the case too. But it does tell us that the sensor is able to read 3/4 of the sensor's vertical height at 120 frames per second. And so that does tell us something about what the frames per second could be. My guess is with the mechanical shutter, you're probably going to have at least 16 frames per second because that's what Canon has on their DSLR, the 1DX Mark III. It's pretty amazing that they can do 16 frames per second with a mechanical shutter. But it could go higher. You know, there's no mirror now, so theoretically wouldn't be shocked if they're at 18 or 20 frames per second with the mechanical shutter. Those would be accomplishments. That would be a shockingly fast shutter. And I'm going to guess that the frames per second with the electronic shutter is 120 frames per second. But it's definitely going to be at least 100 frames per second because if they can do 6K at 120 frames per second, they should be able to do the full sensor readout at 100 frames per second. But I'm inclined to say they're going to do 120 frames per second because the Sony A9 Mark III does 120 frames per second. And I don't think Canon is going to let Sony have a higher number than them. Like, this history of having a higher frames per second goes back to the 50s. So we're looking at like 70 years of the camera manufacturers battling with their sports cameras to have a higher frames per second. I also wouldn't be surprised if Canon beats them by a little bit. If they offer 130 or 140 frames per second just to snub their noses at the A9 Mark III. Some other miscellaneous specs. It's going to have 2 CF Express Type B cards. It's going to have USB 4, which is just the newest version of USB-C. It'll use the same USB-C connectors. It'll have a full HDMI port in case you're hooking up a field recorder to it or something. It's going to have the updated version of eye control autofocus, which premiered in the Canon R3. I didn't like it, but this has a bigger viewfinder on it, probably works better than the previous one did, so I can't wait to try it out. I'm excited for it. If this works well, it really could help out sports photographers who need to track a specific subject. Their price, they said, isn't final, but they're suggesting it's about $6,500, and that sounds about right. But weirdly, it's more expensive than the A9 Mark III, despite lacking the global shutter. But then again, if I had to pick, I think I'd rather have more dynamic range than a global shutter. But honestly, those differences are really splitting hairs, and I don't think many sports photographers would ever take a single picture where it would turn out significantly better on this camera versus the Sony A9 Mark III, so maybe that doesn't really matter. Let's quickly look at how it compares to the Canon R3. The Canon R3 is limited to 30 frames per second with full autofocus tracking, or will do 190 frames per second in a special burst mode. The Canon R1 will do 120 frames per second, but like real frames per second with autofocus tracking, not the sort of viewfinder locked out, the experience that you get on the Canon R3. And I bet it will have burst mode, but we don't know what it is yet. And they both have pre-release, and the Canon R1 will have a readout speed of about 2 to 3 times faster than the Canon R3. Comparing it to the biggest rival, Sony A9 Mark III, well, they both have 24 megapixel sensors. I think they're both going to be right about 120 frames per second maxed out. They both have pre-release. The Canon R1 has a readout speed of 1/500th of a second, whereas it's 0 milliseconds for Sony's global shutter. The A9 Mark III is a tilty screen, which means it's less versatile. You can't use it in many different video situations, like where you might need to film yourself. But then again, some people prefer the tilty screen. The R1 has that flippy screen, and the R1 will likely have better dynamic range and a lower base ISO thanks to not using global shutter technology. The Z9 doesn't seem like a close rival because it has a 45 megapixel sensor. It's what I'm using for wildlife photos and videos right now. The Z9 only does 30 frames per second full readout. But when you talk raw files, it only does 20 frames per second. And that's way below the 120 frames per second of the R1. But I included it because I shot a lot of sports with the Z9 in its 11 megapixel, 120 frames per second JPEG mode. And it does great. And if you're a sports photographer currently shooting JPEG, that might be good enough for you. And when we do review the R1, subscribe to see that, we will be comparing the Nikon Z8 and Z9 against it. They both support pre-release, and the Nikon Z9 has a slower readout speed than the R1, about twice as slow. But again, I've never noticed a problem with that, even shooting lots of action. The Z9 unfortunately has a tilted screen, which means it's less versatile, which means if you're going to be shooting some video, you might need to bring an entirely second body, whereas the R1 gives you that flippy screen, gives you the extra versatility. In the comments down below, let me know what you think. I personally am a little disappointed that it's not the higher megapixel sensor, but this is a tool very specifically for professional sports photographers who really are printing small images, and the bigger files would only sort of slow down their workflow. And thank you to our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace.com/Tony is where you go when you have anything that you want to share on the web. Of course, a business deserves its own custom domain, the ability to take appointments and deposits from clients, to sell things online and automatically integrate it into your shipping system. You can do all that and so much more with Squarespace. But I also think personal projects should have their own Squarespace website. Stop sharing stuff on social media, which is making a profit off of you. Start hosting your own content and sending people to your own domains at squarespace.com/Tony. Try it out for free. Just see what it's like. No credit card required. And I promise you're going to be blown away by how easy it is to make an awesome looking website that works great on computers and mobile devices and everything else. After you try it out, the coupon code Tony will get you 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace. Bye.